seed. He's going to be on the play here for game number 1. And, of course, this is a best of 5. We're going to have 2 games pre-sideboard and 3 post if it comes to it.
So he will be on the play. The Boros Aggro player, a little slow start. Snubboard Century is the turn 1.
Yeah, that's very rarely the turn 1 play you want because there's basically no way it's going to be attacking for damage on turn 2. But it does survive combat pretty well against these 1 and 2 power creatures from Jessup. So if he had something like another Snubboard Century and a Legion's Landing, it would be a really easy way to trade Legion's Land or transform Legion's Landing without too much detriment to your side of the battlefield.
Turn 2 play for Buchholz is going to be a Danto Vanguard. Meanwhile, Jessup setting up with Land War Elves, and then he has turn 2 Wild Growth Walker, Breeding Pool tapped as well. Yeah, Buchholz wants to get that off the table quick.
Yeah, absolutely. He's going to need something like Conclave Tribunal here to do so. Otherwise, Dan Jessup is threatening to gain a significant amount of life on the following turn.
See what our Boros Aggro player can do about it. You see some Convoking. There is the Tribunal. Wild Growth Walker exiled.
Yeah, and there's an attack for 3. And I want to point out, even though Snubhorn Century doesn't have any power right now, it is going to be pretty big in a few turns here if Buchholz continues deploying permanents. But any body is a good body when you have a Convoke spell in your hand, like a Tribunal or with that Venerated Luxodon.
Yeah, it's sort of doing its own Land War Elf impression on that side of the table. See Jessup now at 17. We'll go to his 3rd turn. In this circumstance, kind of the best thing he could have would be a backup Wild Growth Walker. Though in his deck, there's some action he can have when he gets to 3 and 4 mana. Jade Light Ranger would be fine.
Yeah, right now, a Tamio Collector of Tales also wouldn't be too bad. Start filling up the graveyard. Has 6 loyalty when it ticks up, so rather difficult for Buchholz to kill unless he can deploy 4 permanents on the following turn. But Jessup just going to go with a 2/2 Hydroid Krasis. It's a fine turn 3 play.
Yeah, he'll go to 18 and pass it back. We'll see how much pressure Evan will be able to apply here. He's at 6 permanents, so getting closer to that City's Blessing.
Yeah, but it looks like he has a bunch of lands in hand. At least 2 that I know of a Plains and a Sacred Foundry. But hopefully for him, he has a bit more action here. And a Venerated Luxodon is what the doctor ordered.
Yeah, it's going to grow the Sentry and the Vanguard. Expect to see him play one of those lands. Yep, there's a tapped Sacred Foundry, so now up to 8 permanents. He'll pass to Jessup. Yeah,
and as long as he draws a castable spell next turn, as well as that land in hand, he should be able to turn on the City's Blessing and make that Snubhorn Century into a 4/4 attacker.
This is a scary start. Jessup's going to shock to 16 for an Overgrown Tomb. There's Wild Growth Walker, a tap of 3, Jade Light Ranger, back to 22.
Yeah, great follow-up from Dan Jessup here. He's going to go back up to 22 life, get that Wild Growth big, get a couple more lands in hand so he can make sure he curves naturally into that, command the Dreadhorde, or start double spelling if he gets something like Tamio active.
Yeah, Woodland Cemetery and Watery Grave picked up from the Explorers. No attacks. He'll pass back to Buchholz. Ooh, another land drawn. I believe the hand currently 3 lands.
Yeah, that's what it looks like to me. Clifftop Retreat and 2 plains. That's one of the downsides to playing aggro decks in this format. Sometimes you don't draw your good top-end spells like Experimental Frenzy, or in this case, you wanted more of those 3s and 4s like Banaush Marshal and Venerated Luxodon, or just some more explosive starts, because a 1-drop into a 2-drop is... it's a pretty fine start from the Boros aggro deck, but really what you want is that triple 1-drop starts and then trying to transform Legion's Landing. Then if you flood out, you actually have something to do with all that extra mana.
And you mentioned the red mana in this Boros deck. That is for Experimental Frenzy, though. Those are in the sideboard. We're going to have 2 game 1s to play before we get to that. He checked the first Wild Growth Walker, but he's not going to be able to do anything about this second one.
Yeah, and that's great news for Jessup because he's just wanting to create a large presence here to play defense against Buchholz, make it so that Buchholz can't really afford a profitable attack, and then eventually he just fills up his graveyard with either a Tamio Collector of Tales or some more Explorer creatures, or just trading in combat, and then eventually command the Dreadhorde for a significant amount. Now, if he doesn't draw Command the Dreadhorde or isn't able to fill up his graveyard, he can actually just find some more Hydroid Krasis and just start casting those and start attacking through the air.
Plains go was all Buchholz could muster. We'll go to Jessup. He'll play that Woodland Cemetery he explored into.
If I'm Jessup, you have to know at this point that your opponent just has all lands in hand. Otherwise, he would have definitely gotten the City's Blessing on the previous turn.
Vraska Golgari Queen shows up, takes care of the Snubhorn Century, and now the Krasis will fly in for 2. Buchholz to 18.
It's always a good sign if you're the Sultai player when you feel comfortable enough to attack, even when you have a Planeswalker on the battlefield.
Another land picked up from Buchholz. Thing is getting a little bit worse for him every turn. Cliff Top Retreat, go.
I was trying to think of a really good Millhouse pun because he's flooding. You know, the episode
yeah,
of Millhouse.
but his cuffs are bone dry.
Right, because
everything's coming out Millhouse.
Yeah, there it is.
In this case, I guess Danny Jessup going to be our Millhouse because he is not a victim of this flood.
No, and he's everything's basically going his way. He had that turn 2 Wild Growth Walker. He had a Land Elves on the first turn. Obviously, the first one got taken care of, but that didn't actually end up being a big deal because he had the follow-up. And since Buchholz didn't have that really, really explosive start that the white aggro decks are prone to, he was able to just basically reinvest on turn 4 with Wild Growth into Jade Light, thanks to that Land Elves.
Jessup floats a mana before sacrificing his Hinterland Harbor to that Vraska. Draws a card, goes to 23. And here is another Hydroid Krasis.
Yeah.
X equals 4.
Yeah, and since he did float that mana, he did have 6 total mana for this for Hydroid Krasis, and now he has 6 power in the air. Might close this game out rather quickly.
2 more cards, 2 more life, and another attack for 2. Buchholz to 16. And Llanowar Elves go back Evan's way. Can he draw a spell?
I don't think so. He doesn't play very many of those. Only 40.
The ratio not panning out for him the way he drew it up.
Now, this is one of the beautiful things, though, about the SCG Invitationals here. We have best of 5 matches here in the top 8, so that if things do start to go awry, you actually have a shot to come back. You know, this flood here in game 1, you know, this game is not over by any means because Buchholz could draw a couple of really good ones off the top. Danny could flood out from here. You know, I believe Danny's got a bunch of lands in hand right now. And Buchholz, you know, like he has a potential draw to get back into this game.
Yeah, there was a bit of a swing in his favor. He drew Conclave Tribunal, took care of that other Wild Growth Walker, made an attack at the Vraska. That one went down. So now Jessup's going to follow it up with a Nissa who shakes the world.
Yeah, I think this one's going to close it out pretty quick here. This is 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 damage potentially coming through on this turn alone.
And from 25, he's not concerned about trying to block.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, he activates a land. He's going to attack with everything. 6 in the air, 7, 8 off Llanowar Elves, 10 from the Ranger, 3 more from the land. 13, like you said, Buchholz to 3.
Yeah, he actually tapped his Overgrown Tomb as well, or untapped it with the Nissa Who Shakes the World. And with her ability, he can actually tap it for black, get a green, and cast the Assassin Trophy in hand.
Card drawn, Adanto Vanguard for Evan. He'll cast that.
And now it doesn't really matter what Buchholz does. If he attacks to try to knock down Nissa Who Shakes the World, it's going to leave him vulnerable to all these small creatures attacking as well as the Hydroid Krasis. He's at 3, facing down 6 power from Krasis. There's not a lot he can do here.
Right, yeah, just that 1/4/4 Krasis will seal it here for Jessup. So Buchholz just hangs back, go back Danny's way. The writing is on the wall for this one, though. Float a mana, turn that Hinterland Harbor into a 3/3 creature with the Nissa.
And here we're basically just covering all bases, making sure we don't make a mistake. You know, using our mana before we untap the land, and then sending everything in here.
Yep, cast Llanowar Elves, going to shove with those lands and those Krasis. Couple blocks for Buchholz, but the Flyers will connect, and Danny Jessup up a game.
And this is kind of how I suspected at least one of the pre-sideboard games would go. Jessup, as long as he draws at least 1 or 2 Wild Growth Walkers and Buchholz draws fewer than that number of Conclave Tribunals, he has a good shot of stabilizing against Buchholz's early aggression. And then as the game progresses, he has all of these haymakers that really push him far ahead. Hydroid Krasis, Command the Dreadhorde, and even some of these Planeswalkers like Nissa Who Shakes the World can generate an extra 3/3 body every single turn while also giving you just busted Hydroid Krasis turns.
Players will shuffle up here for game number 2. Remember, we will play 2 pre-board games.
Yeah, we're kind of mirroring the Mythic Championship structures where in a best-of-5 scenario, you don't want sideboards to play the entire match for you. You know, you want to have the decks kind of battle in a more natural way. This was mostly, I think, due to the nature of Modern when they were doing back when they were doing Modern Pro Tours, and the sideboard's having such an adverse effect on how the game's played out after board.
Yeah, and when you just add more games, it doesn't make a ton of sense to just completely destroy the ratio, right? Having 4 sideboard game and 1 pre-board would be very odd.
Right.
Jessup was able to break serve here, though. Was able to pick up a win on the draw pre-sideboard in a matchup that he estimates is pretty rough for him.
Yeah, I think he is dramatically overstating how bad the matchup is. I actually think that it's very close, and it's very draw dependent. In that scenario, Dan drew multiple Wild Growth Walkers, actually sequenced very well, so that one of the Wild Growth Walker turns was actually safe from the removal of Conclave Tribunal, and that 6-point life buffer was huge. He was even heads up enough to play a 2/2 Hydro Crisis on turn 3, even though that is very rarely the correct thing to do, but he needed to utilize his mana, potentially put up a blocker, as well as protect himself from a number of other things.
Players going to draw up their opening 7s for game number 2. Buchholz looking for maybe a little bit more aggressive start with a little bit fewer lands. He will have to mulligan to 6. You're talking a little bit about Modern and sideboard cards. Well, we do have a Modern set coming out, Modern Horizons. You can pre-order that today. Ships Friday, June 14th. Check that out at go.srctgames.com/mh1. Ton of new cards for Modern. This set will not be standard legal, but does go immediately into Modern. So it's an innovative set in that regard.
Yeah, it's a really interesting vehicle to put old cards into Modern, as well as create new cards specifically for Modern and older formats, so that they can do some stuff that's a little more powerful than you would normally see in Standard.
A lot of cool reprints and new cards in there. I'm pretty excited for that set.
Oh, me too.
I got to play some Pack Wars against Tom Ross with Modern Horizons last night.
Oh, that sounds great. I've been testing Modern Horizons on Versus Live with Ross Merriam, who made top 16 at the Invitational. Really strong finish. Unfortunately for him, he put up a weak Standard showing, but went 8-0 in Modern with that Is It Phoenix strat.
Yeah, that's a good record. Unfortunately, a little bit short for him, but these players are in the top 8. We're underway here. Buchholz on the play with a Law Rune Enforcer this time. Jessup will shock for an Overgrown Tomb to cast Llanowar Elves. Really
cool design for Law Rune Enforcer. As someone who plays quite a few mana creatures, having your Llanowar Elves tapped down by a Master Decoy type creature is always really annoying. So I like the design that it can only tap things that are bigger than it. Doesn't really stifle mana development in the early turns that well.
Yeah, and it'll knock Jessup to 17. Turn 2 play is a Danto Vanguard. We'll go Jessup's way. See if he has that Wild Growth Walker again. Merfolk Branch Walkers, where he will start here. Breeding Pool explored into. Play that tapped. Reasonable blocker online as we go back to Buchholz.
Yeah, and another turn 1 Llanowar Elf start from Danny is exactly where you want to be in a matchup that doesn't have a lot of removal and that is a lot about racing.
Benelish Marshall pre-combat. Buchholz going to attack with the Vanguard and the Enforcer. This is an attack for 6. The Enforcer now has 3 toughness, so the Branch Walker can't really do anything there.
Yeah, and the Vanguard can also protect itself in combat for a paltry 4 life. And when you're on the offensive, 4 life is not a lot to spend to effectively kill your opponent's creature for free.
Jessup's just going to take it. He'll go to 11, and then we'll go to his turn.
Danny really needs to have some answer for this Benelish Marshall next turn, but luckily for him, if he does have the answer, Buchholz did mulligan, and his hand does contain 1 more land and just another 1-drop creature, so not a whole lot to fade other than that if he's able to get this pump effect off the battlefield.
Okay, Overgrown Tomb tapped the land for turn. You see a Tamiyo Collector of Tales hanging out in hand. Not the best card when you're behind.
No, but if he's able to stabilize, it is one of the better draws because it does accrue a bunch of loyalty. It can rebuy a removal spell if you have one. It is a really powerful card in a lot of ways. And I think we, or at least I, really misevaluated it when it was first previewed.
Jessup past turn, no action, no attacks. We'll see what Buchholz can add here. Pre-combat, thinking about tapping a blocker with that Law Rune Enforcer. Of course, that would be the Branch Walker, as he can't target the elf.
Buchholz here trying to figure out the best course of action. My gut says just attack with Danto Vanguard Maybe Banash Marshall too, but definitely not the Law Rune Enforcer, because the way that Danny postured there, you have to assume that there's some removal spell coming, and then it becomes whether or not you want to potentially trade Branchwalker and Elf for your Banash Marshall, and Buchholz has declined.
All right, looks like he does land an attack with just the Vanguard. Jessup's going to go ahead and cast down the Marshall, but then just take the 3 to 8. Clifftop retreats, the land for Buchholz, Stumbled Sentry, and another Enforcer.
He's got 8 permanents, so next turn if he actually can draw a History Benalia or Legion's Landing, he can turn on the City's Blessing and make that Support Sentry into a very, very real attacker.
Jessup plays Hinterland Harbor, and here's Nissa, who shakes the world. Wake up that Overgrown Tomb as a 3/3.
Now, last game we saw him do this with Assassin's Trophy in hand, and if he has either Assassin's Trophy or cast down, he can cast that after blocking as well, and if he does, it's a pretty big deal.
So that land will connect Buchholz to 17. He will then use the Enforcer to tap down the Branchwalker, and we'll see what he can draw. As you mentioned, History of Benalia would get him to the City's Blessing. Looks like the pickup was Conclave Tribunal.
If he has Conclave Tribunal, that's a pretty big deal. He can clear off this Nissa who shakes the world, which is threatening to give him a bunch of power over the next few turns, as well as a bunch of mana. Unluckily for him, though, Conclave Tribunal does not knock off that 3/3 land because it is a non-land permanent clause.
So he's going to use the Sentry to convoke out the Tribunal, take care of the Nissa, and attack with the Vanguard, leaving up Law Rune Enforcer activation here.
Right. And unfortunately for him, the clause of Law Rune Enforcer says converted mana cost 2 or greater, and lands, of course, have a converted mana cost of 0.
Vanguard connects, Jessup to 5. We'll go to his turn. I believe his draw last turn was Wild Growth Walker.
Yeah, so if he can find Jadelight Ranger or something here, that would be a huge boon for his life total and give him a blocker large enough to stop that Subhorn Sentry. But, I mean, these Law Rune Enforcers can potentially be problematic. If he taps out here to play something like Hydroid Krasis, you know, he's going to be staring down quite a bit of power on the following turn as long as Buchholz draws, well, any permanent, which his deck is 40 of them.
And that Krasis, if he wants to make it big, he has to tap creatures to cast it.
60 permanents in the main deck. My fault.
Yeah, I understand how it looks like a draft deck, but
not nearly enough +2/+2s, like Moment of Heroism and stuff. Need more things like that. Ooh, I like this play here from Jessup. He's actually going to Tamio minus on the cast down. And now he has a protection spell to kill that Snubhorn Sentry. And these tappers, the Law Rune Enforcers, can't tap down the Elf or the Overgrown Tomb.
Yeah, nice play. We see the Enforcer tap down the Branchwalker on the end step. We'll go to Buchholz. Believe he drew another Conclave Tribunal.
That's pretty good here, but I don't know if I would burn it. He kind of has to in order to turn on Snubhorn Sentry.
So he does cast it. As you mentioned, that's the 10th permanent.
Yeah, it does say non-land on it, if I'm not mistaken. Non-land permanent, so I don't think he can hit that 3/3 land. He would love to get that off the battlefield so he can attack more freely.
Yeah, you used to see a lot of cards that called out specific card types. You saw that a lot more in the pre-Planeswalker era. Now you more commonly see non-land.
I think Dan kind of has to give up the Ghost here. Let that Tamio go to the Ben. I think he needs to cast down on the Snubhorn Sentry. Oh, no, if he does, he's dead. I'm sorry. Actually, he might just be dead anyway.
So the Tribunal took the Llanowar Elf. Jessup floated a mana. He'll cast down on the Sentry. But looks like 5 damage coming across. That's Jessup's life total.
Yeah, I just missed it. That was just lethal there. He only had 2 blockers. He needed to be able to block, and use the cast down. Buchholz there, picking off the Elf very smartly there.
All right, yeah, so now we have concluded the pre-sideboard games. Everything is all tied up. We'll be advancing to up to 3 post-sideboard games.
And if you ask Dan Jessup, he's happy to get out of those pre-sideboard games 1-1. But we do have a little bit of a sideboard insight that before we talk about it, I want to let his brother Andrew Jessup talk about it. So if we have that queued up, let's go ahead and toss down to Matthias Hunt as he interviews Danny Jessup's brother Andrew.
I am here with Andrew Jessup, recent invitational champion, brother of Dan Jessup, who right now is in the feature match area. He's playing Sultai Dreadhorde, and he drew the only aggro deck in the top 8 in Boros aggro. Is that a happy thing? Or
No, there's a bunch of Esper decks in top 8. By far would rather play against all of them. The Boros aggro matchup, despite traditionally people think like the white aggro matchups are a good matchup for Sultai, but the Dreadhorde list is obviously way different, where Dan doesn't really have Fine Finality and Hostage Takers, which are like the two big cards that typical Sultai uses to typically crush the white decks. But it's definitely a bit harder. It's still winnable, but not the matchup you wanted to draw.
Yeah, so in the first couple of games, he was really relying on things like Wild Growth Walker to kind of like life game and run away with the game. I do want to talk about some of his sideboarding plans as we go into these games. So we have 3 Brontodons, a cast down, negates, Obnixus's Cruelty, Elder Spell. He's got some removal he can go to, but how does the game plan change here as we go to our sideboarded games?
Wild Growth Walker is still going to be the biggest deal. You want to establish one early, just get big creatures, apply pressure, make it so they can't really attack through, bolster your life total. So that's definitely what he's looking to do still. The Takali Honor Guards out of the board of the white deck make it a bit more difficult, but this deck's a bit higher on spot removal than, like I said, most of the other Sultai lists, because you don't really have those Fine Finality slots. It's going to have more spot removal spells, so if we could take those out. That's pretty much it. I think it's the Planeswalkers get a bit annoying too. Out of the white sideboard, he's got 4 Gideons. We think he's probably going to bring in 3 Frenzies, but otherwise the game plan is going to be relatively the same of just come off the ground and then eventually push through. So
Dan's expecting his opponent to really sideboard heavy here. We have 3 Frenzy, 3 Tocatli, 4 Gideon. You wouldn't be surprised if we brought in all 10 of those cards?
Yeah, the Gideons should most likely come in. There's potential his opponents feared about maybe the ground gets clogged and he's not that good, but Dan doesn't have any great answers to it, so we're definitely a bit afraid of that one.
I guess last question. So for Dan's strategy, the finisher, Command the Dreadhorde, obviously a card that you need a lot of life to cast. How many of those does he even have after sideboard?
The plan is 0 currently, so unless something plays out differently where he thinks he needs them or he sees his opponent's sideboards in a way where he wants them, we plan on having 0 on the deck. So.
All right, we'll see if the removal, less Dreadhorde plan works. Let's head back to the match.
All right, so those are some great insights from Jessup's brother, Andrew Jessup, the previous invitational champion.
Yeah, the reigning one-time champion of the world.
So you're going to see Jessup go into more of a generic mid-range Sultai deck. Now for Buchholz, his sideboard options here, we have 4 copies of Gideon Blackblade, 4 Baffling End, 3 Tocatli Honor Guard, 3 Experimental Frenzy, and another Danto Vanguard. What do you think he's going to approach this matchup with?
Well, you heard it from Andrew himself. He thinks Gideon Blackblade is quite good in the matchup. I'm inclined to agree. And if I'm being honest, I actually think that all 15 cards here can come in for Buchholz. If he wants to basically increase his curve slightly, bring in a couple more expensive cards, maybe cut some of the 1-drops that are weaker in the matchup, like those 1-mana 2/1s, for example, he can actually just bring in all 15. And I'm not sure that that is wrong.
Yeah, Baffling End and Honor Guard, those are both pretty good cards for breaking up the Explore package.
Yeah, and you expect a lot of removal after sideboard. And, of course, both these players know each other's deck list, so he knows that there's Obnixus's Cruelty coming in. Probably going to be some Brontodons coming in because so he can't rely on Conclave Tribunal to get the job done by itself. So he's going to need those Tocatli Honor Guards. And we saw Danto Vanguard in the first 2 games being pretty solid, attacking through those kind of middling creatures from Dan Jessup's side.
And I think the coup de grace here, the reason to be Boros, a card that might have been able to salvage game 1, those 3 Experimental Frenzies.
Absolutely, and it's not going to be as good in this deck as it is in the mono red Frenzy decks, just because you don't have the potential to burn your opponent out from 20 on some turns.
Right.
But it is going to allow you to redeploy battlefield full of threats after battlefield full of threats, even in the face of a bunch of removal and trades and even sweeper effects.
All right, so Jessup did break serve here. You see he was the 8 seed to the 1, but Buchholz won game 2, so Jessup will be on the play.
Jessup here contemplating whether or not he wants to keep this hand for game 3 of our quarterfinal match.
It's like a shrug and a keep for Buchholz be mulliganing.
Yeah, so that was a pretty long tank from Dan. That hand must be a bit mediocre, but probably has something like a Wild Growth Walker, or not Wild Growth Walker, a Merfolk Branchwalker, which could ultimately completely change how his draw ends up, whether or not he hits a land, and probably decided that the gamble was worthwhile.
Yeah, it looked like a 2-lander that had a little bit of a higher curve. It's one of those hands where if you hit, then you're doing pretty well. If not, you're just not even playing Magic.
Now, notably, even though Dan Jessup is playing Sultai Command the Dreadhorde, you see it's even in the name. Andrew brought up a great point that a lot of times you need a high life total for Command the Dreadhorde to do much of anything. And against aggro decks, it's fairly common for these Sultai Dreadhorde decks to basically sideboard into a normal Sultai mid-range strategy and kind of ignore that whole Command the Dreadhorde aspect. Cards like Tomio Collector of Tales are a bit worse against the aggro strats, as well as Command the Dreadhorde itself. So we could see a lot of that top end kind of get taken out in favor of these more cheaper interactive spells like Cast Down, Obnix's Cruelty, and Thrashing Bronodon.
All right, Buchholz kept on 6, squared at top. Tap Breeding Pool for Jessup. Turn 1 play a Sky Marcher Aspirant for Buchholz.
So a Sky Marcher Aspirant for me kind of signifies that Buchholz did not bring in all 15 cards. That would be probably the second 1-drop creature I would take out.
After the Enforcer?
Yeah.
Right, there was Branch Walker for Jessup on turn 2. Explored an Overgrown Tomb to hand, which seemed to be the box that he was trying to check.
Now that I think about it, Law Room might actually not be that bad after sideboard. I think the cards that I would want to get out of the deck are probably like Dauntless Bodyguard and maybe Stubhorn Sentry, cards that just kind of sit on the ground and don't do a whole lot.
Right, Buchholz has kind of the curve you want in this deck.
Absolutely.
Turn 2, double 1-drop. So now he has 3, and one of them is Legion's Landing, threatening to transform that next turn.
And these are the nightmare scenarios for most strategies in Standard when you're playing against these aggressive white decks. You know, they triple 1-drop, they threaten to transform Legion's Landing, and all of a sudden they have a burst of potentially 4 mana on the third turn and just deploy so many threats that are tough to deal with.
So there was no attack there. We go to Jessup. He's going to cast another Branch Walker. Llanowar Elves was revealed. That'll go to the graveyard. Overgrown Tomb tapped, and he'll leave back these blockers. And that 3/2 Branch Walker is nice because he gets to eat the Sentry if Buchholz goes to transform the landing.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think Buchholz really wanted that second Branch Walker to hit a land as well. That way all the 2/1s would be trading and not eating. But this is a great follow-up here for Buchholz. He's going to be pumping his whole squad, jamming in for a chunk of damage and transforming that Legion's Landing.
Yeah, shocks for a Benelish Marshal to 18, and here comes the Alpha Strike. The attack is for 6. You see the Branch Walkers will trade with the non-sentries. Buchholz will gain 2 life off of the Vampire token back to 20. Jessup goes to 19. First Fort is transformed.
Yeah, this is a great start for Buchholz, but Danny does have the battlefield cleaned up a bit. Buchholz does just have land and, he has just 2 cards left in his hand. And if Jessup has a pair of removal spells, you know, then he's just going to be casting spells as normal like Hydrocrisis against the Adonto the First Fort.
You do see a pair of Krasis pushed to the front of Danny's hand here. Not too effective with how little mana he has so far. Cast down on the Marshal. Is there a land drop?
I believe there is.
Watery Grave tapped.
I think he has quite a few lands and spells. He just doesn't have the capability to double spell on any of these turns. You saw him really take pause on that Llanowar Elf on turn 3 when he explored it. He was thinking about leaving it on top so he could potentially double spell on this turn.
All right, back up Marshal for Buchholz. Attack for 1 with the Sentry, Jessup to 18. And Adonto Vanguard post-combat, so he's empty-handed but has some pretty good pressure on the table.
Yeah, right now we're looking at 8 permanents. So a 1-drop plus an activation of Adonto the First Fort could potentially turn on the Snubhorn Sentry as well as City's Blessing.
We'll see what Jessup can do about it. The draw was Obnix's Cruelty.
That was not a bad one, but now you have to choose between knocking down the Benelish Marshal or the Adonto Vanguard. Your removal is pretty weak normally to Adonto Vanguard itself, but Benelish Marshal is just so good.
And he does go for the Marshal here with the Cruelty. Plays Breeding Pool tapped.
And if he has a land next turn, he can actually make a 4/4 Hydroid Krasis, which is large enough to block the Adonto Vanguard as well.
We'll go back to Buchholz. Attack with the Vanguard, Jessup to 15. Post-combat, another Sentry. Doesn't have the City's Blessing yet, but he can activate that First Fort now on this turn. And
and again on the next turn, and that'll be just enough permanents to get him there. So this is looking pretty good for Buchholz, even in the face of all this removal. And you're kind of seeing what happens out of these Sultai mid-range decks when they don't have a way to stop the Legion's landing once it's already transformed.
So there's been no Wild Growth Walker in this game for Jessup. Here's a Jadelight Ranger, draws Overgrown Tomb, and there's a Walker, but it's late. He's going to put that one in the graveyard.
Yeah, it is just basically one turn too late because he would have loved to have gone Jadelight Ranger plus Wild Growth in the same turn to gain 6 life.
Jessup plays that Overgrown Tomb tapped. We'll go back to Buchholz. He makes the Vampire token on the end step. 9 permanents and a tap of 4. Oh, Experimental Frenzy.
That's a pretty good 10th permanent.
Blessing.
Good.
City's Blessing indeed.
Now, what's cool about the Experimental Frenzy in this deck is that with the Convoke cards, you can Convoke off the top of your deck. So you effectively get a bunch more mana sometimes when you get lucky on things like Venerated Luxon or Conclave Tribunal.
Right, both Sentries and the Vanguard coming across. Those are all 3-power attackers. The Vampire token is going to join them as well. So
Dan here in a spot of trouble, I would say. Definitely going to be looking to trade his Jadelight Ranger here for probably Snubhorn Sentry. He's looking at 7 damage coming across, but he may want to just eat that Vampire token this turn and then trade next turn. He's taking a bit of damage to do it, but he's ultimately clearing off more total number of creatures.
So he does line up, blocks the Vampire token, takes 9 to 6. Buchholz will go to 21 off that lifelink and pass his turn. Jessup will draw. Hinterland Harbor was the draw.
And even without a land here, that Hydrocrisis will get him up to 8 life, and with 2 blockers for these 3 attackers, he should be safe from lethal, even through a Conclave Tribunal or some removal spell.
He'll play the Harbor. Hydrocrisis, X equals 5. Go to 8, draw 2 cards.
A bit unfortunate for Jessup that Vraska Golgari Queen does not say permanent 4 or less. Can't knock off that Experimental Frenzy.
All right, so Buchholz will draw for turn, checks the top card. He'll cast that. Sky Marcher Aspirant.
And here you're just going to see, as long as he doesn't hit land off the top, he's going to be able to cast a large number of cards this turn. And if he hits something like Baffling End or Conclave Tribunal, it's going to give him the ability to clear off this Hydrocrisis and kind of start attacking freely.
Next card was Sacred Foundry. He'll shock to 19 for that. And then cast a Legion's Landing. Makes a Vampire token. Takes a look at another card.
He's already played a land, so if it is a land, doesn't do anything. But tapping 3 here. That's a good one.
Benelish Marshal.
That one's really good.
And another spell, it looks like, off the top as well. Another Aspirant.
Yeah, and he's still not done yet. If he hits a Convoke spell, he can still cast it. A Conclave Tribunal or a Venerated Luxon here.
Took a look. He'll go to combat. Now he has 3 4-powers attackers.
Yeah, so the Crisis can still basically eat something, but that's okay. We're going to transform the new Legion's Landing. We're going to basically get a chump block from the Jadelight Ranger.
Yeah, Ranger in front of Vanguard, Crisis in front of one of the Sentries. 4 damage coming across. Jessup will go to 4 here. Buchholz will pay the 4 life to 15 to keep the Vanguard around.
And here specifically, you can see why Command the Dreadhorde is no longer in the deck. Dan's going to be at 4 life, can't really afford to cast it, and this is why they've chosen to side it out.
Right, we'll go to Jessup. He draws for turn. He has to deal with a lot of cardboard here.
Yeah, I don't think there's a way out in this particular game, but I've seen crazier things happen. Let's see if Danny can figure it out.
Went into the turn with 7 mana. Now, one thing about Sultai, we've seen a lot of Sultai decks just in the more recent standard formats. They used to play Fine Finality, and that was a good way to get out of spots like this. But they just don't play that card anymore.
Well, yeah, they've gone bigger, right? Command the Dreadhorde allows you to be a bit better against these Planeswalker-centric decks. Fine Finality is good at grinding through traditional spot removal, but Command the Dreadhorde is just so disgusting when it's active and you're at like a decently high life total.
Oh, yeah. Plays really well in the mid-range matchups, but not going to do it here. Jessup's going to pack him up.
Tell you what, Dan Jessup did figure it out. figured out that he could not win. Packed it in.
My line here is to try to win the next 2. Back against the wall, though. Buchholz up 2-1. One more win for him would put him into the top 4.
All right, so what are you thinking if you're Dan Jessup right now, right? Back against the wall, 1 game potentially left to knock you out of the top 8 here. Lose your chance at the Players' Championship, potentially lose your chance at $20,000. Facing off what I would guess is probably the least favorable matchup out of all the ones in the top 8. Where's your head at?
Probably just thinking about all the trash that Andy's going to talk after the match is over.
I'm hoping that his head's in it. He looks focused. I'm hoping that he is confident in his sideboarding, and I'm curious if he's going to be able to win these next 2.
Yeah, he has a plan here, but he's already a little up against it when it comes to the aggressive elements of the deck, and he's really going to struggle against frenzy draws like that.
Right, and but that's one of the reasons why frenzy is so good, right? Like, if you have a handful of like these disenchant effects or whatever, like they're just not going to be that relevant against the explosive draws featuring a bunch of the small creatures.
You know what I'm thinking about, though?
5 Guys.
Yeah,
that's what I'm thinking.
I do enjoy burgers and fries. I also enjoy sales on Magic cards.
Oh.
Such as the SCGCon Summer Sale. Maybe you were missing an alley from Cairo from your collection.
Maybe, perhaps, you wanted a Beta Lightning Bolt.
I do.
Or is that Alpha? I don't even know the difference.
It's going to be coming down to the corners. It's hard to tell from an image like that. That looks like a beta to me.
All right, well, I got it right. I'm super smart.
The alpha corners are very rounded.
Now, if you want to pick up some of these cards, or, you could check out the sale. Basically, we have a new sale every week. If you go to go.srcgames.com/sale, I guess right now we have the SCGCon Summer Sale going on. I don't know what that entails specifically, but our sales are usually themed. The reason why we just say check out our new sale is because if you're watching this on YouTube, if you're watching this on a VOD, there's a chance that it's a different sale by now because it does change every week, but there's always a cool new theme.
Have missed your crack at Alley from Cairo.
Right, I'm guessing right now this is basically just we have a sale on Arabians and back.
It's looking like that.
Yeah, a lot of old school black border looking cards. But head back to the match here between these 2 players. Buchholz giving a good pile shuffle just because I believe he did the whole 15 in, 15 out thing where you don't really want to show your opponent how many cards you're siding in and siding out, that information hiding game, but sometimes you accidentally have 61 cards, so you want to double check.
They also allow you to pile shuffle once per game, and the rounds are untimed. Not doing it would be a spew.
I mean, doing it also steals time from me, so Buchholz is now time thief.
It's all upside. That's what I'm hearing. I know that our colleague Patrick Sullivan, a big fan of old school cards, he's been walking around this weekend with a Shahrazad that he picked up.
I saw him yesterday with it. He's just like, yeah, they had one at a good price that I liked, and kind of wanted one for a while. Like, okay, man. So you can see both players actually utilizing these brand new Carnox chairs. Carnox, a new sponsor here on the SCG Tour. These gaming chairs are quite comfortable, and I do not like to endorse things that I do not like. Ultimate Guard products, I like. Okie Dokie Dice, haven't used them before, but those commercials are dope. And then these Carnox chairs are super comfy. So if you're interested, you can go to carnox.com/SCG and check them out.
I am likely to purchase one of these.
Yeah, I'm likely to steal one from Star City.
I am more likely to harass Cedric about getting me the hookup.
Chair. Hey, Mr. Carnox executive, if you're watching this right now, I'm a good shill.
Yeah, Peter Carnox, if you're listening.
Nullhide Carnox.
The Carnox and the Hound.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
We can go as deep as you want. Players looking at some opening sevens here. Buchholz is going to mulligan. He's been mulliganing quite a bit in this match.
Yeah, but you really need to have a fast start with these white-based aggro decks. Otherwise, your opponents just have enough time to set up. You know, your strength comes from these explosive draws featuring 1-1 drops or 1-2-3, and then your opponent stumbling.
Saw Jessup give his hand in game number 3 a good think. This one, pretty quick keep, looks like. Jessup will be on the play here, and if there's a game 5, he'll be on the play there as well. He started by breaking serve, but things have gone south since then.
I'm pretty sure if he wins this game, he's not going to be on the play for game 5, but, you know, don't quote me on that.
My mistake.
Unless Buchholz...
I got ahead of myself.
Yeah. I have that problem where my mouth is faster than my brain sometimes.
Well, the problem for me sometimes is that my brain's not moving at all. Just my mouth.
Not enough coffee.
Oh, no.
This is not good for Buchholz, but even if this game does not go his way, he's got one to give. He's up 2-1 right now here in this quarterfinal match.
And mulligan to 5, he is the experimental frenzy deck. That forgives a lot of sins. He still has enough materials to maybe curve into 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 being frenzy, he can really take over the game from there.
Right. And that's kind of one of the reasons why I like boarding in basically all 15 sideboard cards. Takali Honor Guard, quite good in the matchup at shutting down Wild Growth Walker. But on top of that, Baffling End is really good at getting rid of Wild Growth Walker and Jade Light Ranger and those creatures like that. And removal in general is much better when you're playing Experimental Frenzy because it buys you enough time to get to that powerful 4-drop.
Buchholz going to take a look at 5. Can he keep here?
Well, he's got some 1-drops. As long as he has a land, I think you have to keep it, but it looks like he does not have one.
Looking like spells from here.
So if he goes to 4 here, I'm not sure that a good 4-card hand could do it, so he might actually gamble here on a 5 with no land and try to hit a land off of the scry in his draw step, because he is on the draw here, so he has 2 looks, and 2 looks at a land might be a more favorable position.
Yeah, the deck is heavy on 1s, too. You see he keeps on 5, scries to the bottom, though.
That is the look of a man who is ready to pass on 1 with no play.
Ooh, Llanowar Elf versus no plays. Smooth sailing for Jessup so far.
Yeah, and this is a pretty big gamble from Buchholz, and it's not paying off, unfortunately, but honestly, I think it was the right move, and sometimes it just doesn't work out.
Jessup has a Wild Growth Walker. You know, this might be the kind of game that he would lose with a functional hand anyway.
Right. Wild Growth Walker into something like Jade Light or something here, and Danny just applying more pressure, keeping that attack up to close the game before Buchholz is able to draw a land and get out of it.
Yeah, there it is. Wild Growth Walker into Jade Light Ranger. He shocks for it, but he's going to gain 6 life.
Yeah, normally he wouldn't want to shock here, but since Buchholz is not playing anything, he wants to get in that extra chip damage with the Llanowar Elves.
Yeah, I usually play my shock lands untapped when I'm playing Solitaire.
Well, yeah, they don't deal you damage then.
Ooh, and just discarding the hand size is Buchholz. This one's looking to be Jessup's game 4.
I mean, if Danny really thought the matchup was as bad as it is, this is definitely the gimme that he needed to potentially win this match. You know, this was a really good start. I think he would have much rather had this start in game 5 against a functional hand, but you take some where you can get some.
Yeah, Vraska Golgari Queen puts that one up to 6. Buchholz will draw another spell. Life total currently 9. Facing down 6 next turn. Discards again.
9:30 Legacy Challenge players, your 4th and final round pairings are being posted.
Jessup probably won't have lethal this turn, but he will have it next turn. He'll draw a card with his Vraska, floating a mana off that forest he's sacrificing.
Assassin's Trophy, no targets.
Yeah, what a weak draw step. 6 points comes across. Buchholz to 3. Draws another spell. We are going to a deciding game 5 momentarily here. Buchholz is going to make him see it, though.
Just make him do it.
All right, Jessup passes the test.
Buchholz does the math, checks out. Again, honestly, that might look like a misstep from Buchholz, but on 5 cards, I think you have to gamble when you have the spot to, and he had multiple 1-mana spells in hand that he could cast if he drew a land there in the first draw step, as well as that scry. And I think that is the type of hand that you can keep more often than you can win with a 4-card hand.
And it is a tough decision to make. I largely agree with you. You know, it's tough to win in this format with 4 cards, and I like the discipline to keep that hand in such a high-pressure situation. Let's take a look at what these players are playing for. They're already in the top 8, so they locked up at least $3,000, 30 SCG points. Winning this match puts them up to 5,035 points. A finalist of this tournament, 10 grand, 40 points. The winner, 20 grand, 50 SCG points. An invite to the Players' Championship at the end of the year, joining Joe Lissette, Abe Corrigan, Matthew Dilks, and Oliver Tomiko. A lot on the line here. You win this weekend, you also get to make your own personalized token. I know Danny J has to want that.
I hope he's just another Monarch. I hope he just tries to steal his brother's thunder. I know that if my big brother was the Monarch, I would also be the Monarch.
Yeah, definitely. I am an older brother. I have a younger brother.
Yeah.
And if I had the Monarch token, my greatest fear
Is that
would
he
be
would-
my younger
he would
brother
usurp you.
supplanting my
Yeah,
Monarch token.
Of course. I mean, that's just how monarchies work, right? You just get
Yeah, exactly.
Your younger brother just comes up and steals it from you.
Enter a real Game of Thrones situation.
Yeah. The Game of Thrones, you know, live long enough to see yourself become the villain or whatever. I don't know.
Words. Catchphrase. Players looking at 7 cards here.
Look, I ain't trying to get a cease and desist. I don't know what I can say. Like, I don't know what they've copyrighted.
All right, 7 card hands. We'll see if both players can keep.
Buchholz here having a tank. You know, it hurts to mulligan again after you've mulliganed so many times in the first 4 games, but if this hand is not good, you got to throw it back. You have to have a good start.
He has kept 1 7-card hand in this set so far.
Now, this deck does mulligan quite a bit, but luckily for him, Jessup is also going back to the drawing board here, going to look for a better 6.
Now, both players are on the mulligan. Magic decks don't all mulligan with the same equity. Who do you think a double mulligan favors here?
I think it absolutely favors the Sultai Dreadhorde deck. I think they can recoup from mulligan quite well thanks to those Explore creatures, whereas the Boros aggro deck sometimes has draws that are either 10s or 1s, depending on the varied casting costs. Now, with that said, the Boros aggro decks need a lower amount of actual mana to play their spells than the Sultai Dreadhorde deck, but they have not very many ways to actually gain back that raw card advantage. Mulligans also make it less likely that you're going to cast Experimental Frenzy on time, less likely that you trip a 1-drop and turn on that Legion's Landing in time, and as games go longer, your deck is full of these just weaker 1-mana cards that don't do nearly as much.
Yeah, Frenzy, the big value card in the deck, but you're absolutely right. Mulliganing makes it a lot harder to get to the threshold where you are casting that spell. Player's going to look at 6. Ooh, Buchholz once again going to 5.
You hate to see it. Is that like a sarcastic thing? Because I do hate to see it.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I hate to see it, but I have said that phrase sarcastically many times.
Okay. Buchholz here, you know, if you're playing for this much money, a shot at the Players' Championship, and your likeness on a token, you definitely do not want to be going to 5 cards here in the quarterfinals at the SCG Invitational.
Dan has kept on 6. Buchholz on the play. Can he keep 5? On the play, you really can't keep it 0 land hand like he did in Game 4.
Yeah, it looks like he has 1 land and at least 1 drop. So let's see if he can curve out here.
This time he scribes to the top, Jessup to the bottom.
All right.
Sky Marcher Aspirant, turn 1 play.
Here we go. Jessup here going to lead off with the Llanowar Elves to face down that Sky Marcher Aspirant. I'm curious if he wants to block here. This is actually a really cool test, and it looks like he does.
Buchholz offered, Jessup takes it. Turn 2 play, Tocatli Honor Guard. That one can matter against a lot of Jessup's draws.
Absolutely, and if you look, Buchholz actually has a nice little 4-drop hanging out in his hand. If he can draw 2 lands in a row, one of which is red, might get that Frenzy going, and with that Tocatli Honor Guard locking down a lot of the value engine from the Dreadhorde deck, this could be bad for Dan Jessup.
Yeah, tapped Water Grave for Jessup. Passes back. Buchholz will attack him to 19. Legion's Landing was the draw. He'll cast that. No 3rd land. We go to Jessup. Jessup's hand looks pretty heavy on lands.
Yeah, I can't get a great look. My gut says lands and Jade Light Rangers, and I believe he may have drawn an Assassin's Trophy at some point over the last few turns, but might not want to cast it because Buchholz is kind of stuck on 2. And if he gives him a land, that means you turn on Benalich Marshal. That means you turn on History of Benalia, and turning on either of those cards in this scenario could be bad.
Something that is interesting about it, though, the Boros aggro deck does not play any mountains in the 75. So if you do fire off that trophy, you will not unlock the Frenzy, as Buchholz only has planes.
Right.
Tapped Breeding Pool, go. Buchholz will draw. It's another spell. I believe a Venerated Loxodon.
That is a non-bow with Tocatli Honor Guard, but still quite a large creature, but his hand is full of these expensive spells. Can't really do much of anything. And even if I'm Dan Jessup, even if I had an Assassin's Trophy here, I don't think I would cast it.
So there was an attack for 2, Jessup to 16, Buchholz to 21. Go back to Jessup. Draw was Wild Growth Walker. It's a blocker.
Yeah, I think I'd go ahead and deploy that. It doesn't look that threatening, but if you pair it with a removal spell here on the Honor Guard, you can untap and potentially gain, 6 to 9 life, depending.
So he does cast it. Buchholz draws another History of Benalia. No plays, no attacks. This is the opportunity for Jessup to get some momentum going. Thrashing Brontodon will be the play. Watergrave taps. The Brontodon now kind of commanding the battlefield.
Another Legion's Landing from Buchholz. This could potentially turn on one of the Legion's Landings next turn if he attacks, which will give him an extra land and unlock those 3-mana cards in hand. But right now, not looking the greatest. His hand is stocked with these powerful cards and just not enough mana to use them. And if he does send all of his creatures in to transform the landing, he's going to lose 2 of them, including that Tocatli Honor Guard.
Cast down the draw for Jessup. That is going to really turn things in his favor quickly. You see Honor Guard down, Merfolk Branchwalker. Trigger both of these creatures. Go to 20.
Yeah.
Explore.
And knocks off the 3rd creature.
Another Branchwalker up to 23.
What a swing.
Wild Growth Walker on the top. Last card in hand's Forest to put that in the graveyard, but the damage might already be done.
Yeah, and here I definitely like attacking with both creatures. You want to pressure Buchholz. You know his hand is probably full of these expensive cards.
Attack for 6. Buchholz to 15. Draws a land.
Draws a land and a red source here, so he can play History of Benalia, start to get those online.
Shocks to 13 for Sacred Foundry.
Could just play Venerated Loxodon here and have a 4/4 blocker as well as a couple of 2/2 life linkers.
Yeah, Loxodon looks to be where he's landed. Yep, he will grow both of those vampire tokens. Go back to Jessup. We know the card in his hand is a Forest.
We also know he doesn't have a great attack right now. That Venerated Loxodon is a 4/4. Wild Growth's only a 3/5, and everything else only has 3 powers. So if he does ship in with all of his creatures, Buchholz just gets to eat a Venerated Loxodon and then threaten to transform Legion Landing on the following turn.
Yeah, growing those vampire tokens also pretty relevant. That helps him in the damage race here.
Right. Wouldn't be surprised if Jessup just passes turn here after playing a land.
Plays the Forest and passes. Now Buchholz with an opportunity.
Yeah, and it's starting to turn around here. He can start casting History of Benalia's, generate a significantly large battlefield. They have Vigilance, and then once the History pops off, he can start attacking with pretty stout-sized Knights. And at some point, he can attack with enough creatures to transform the Legion's Landing, and that'll allow him to cast Experimental Frenzy and perhaps bury Dan in card advantage, assuming that Thrashing Brontodon is no longer around.
History of Benalia makes a Knight token. We go back to Jessup. Has a decision point whether he wants to go for that history with the Brontodon or not.
Yeah, it's a bit dangerous, but at the same time, it's threatening another 2/2 as well as pumping the Knights on perhaps an important turn in the future.
Tapping 4 mana here. Vraska Golgari Queen.
That's a good draw. That knocks off the history without exposing him really to having to pop off the Venerated Loxodon, and now he still has a potential answer to that Frenzy. Don't even think Buchholz can really play the Frenzy until that Thrashing Brontodon is gone, or he draws a backup Frenzy.
Last card in Jessup's hand was Hinterland Harbor. He'll play that and pass. Now we go to Buchholz. Benelish Marshall is the draw, so there's a lot of gas in the hand right now.
Yeah. It's drawing all the expensive ones. He's unlocked most of them thanks to that Sacred Foundry last turn, but or turn ago. See if he can match Dan Jessup's battlefield here or surpass it.
How much pressure are you feeling to remove that Vraska if you're Buchholz?
A reasonable amount. Jessup's flooded, and if you can clear it, that means he can't turn any of these lands into spells. It's also going to gain him a bit of life here over the next few turns and potentially knock off a History Benalia on a future turn, maybe a Benelish Marshall on a future turn. So it does represent quite a bit of chip damage as well as card advantage, or card cycling.
You see Buchholz kind of looking at what blocks might look like if he attacks. Pulls the Screeches back. He's going to cast Benelish Marshall, pump up the team, and now he'll make attacks.
Now, if all these are going at Vraska, which I think they are, I think there's going to be some pretty clean blocks from Jessup's side. I think the 2-1 Branchwalker is probably going to chump block the Venerated Luxon. Wild Growth's going to eat the Night Token, and then there's going to be a trade, and maybe, yeah, because it's only a 3/3 vampire, so there's going to be a Bronodon trade, or sorry, Bronodon eat a creature, and then Wild Growth eat a creature, and the Vraska stays around. So this attack is literally just trading 3 creatures for 2 Branchwalkers. I don't really love that too much.
So you see everyone coming across, blocking like you said. So Branchwalker's down, one of the vampires and the Night Token down. Buchholz to 17 off of damage. Legion's Landing did transform Teledonta to the first fort. Now he will use that first fort mana. Cast another Legion's Landing, fresh vampire token. Apologies, Buchholz to 19. Those were 3-power vampire tokens.
Right. But now Dan Jessup is actually in a great position. He has simplified the battlefield. The Benelish Marshall is significantly less threatening.
His draw step was blank. He's going to use Vraska to take another look, though. Floats a mana with Hinterland Harbor, draws a card. Another land?
Yeah, but with the threat of something like Cast Down or Assassin's Trophy here, I'm not even sure Buchholz can really ship everything into the red zone to try to knock off that Vraska again. Wow, that was a good draw. This is one of the reasons why Law Rune Enforcer is in the deck to begin with. It's a 1-drop early on for Legion's Landing, sure, but in this spot it's going to be able to tap down one of those large creatures from Dan Jessup's side, and he's going to need a lot of help on the next 2 turns.
Law Rune Enforcer plus that history makes a Night Token. Looking at an attack with the Venerated Loxodon.
This is a good attack. This forces Dan Jessup to either double block or let his Vraska die. I think he has the double block, and he's going to end up losing the Thrashing Bronodon because Buchholz has that Experimental Frenzy looming.
So Loxodon is attacking Vraska. Jessup's so low on resources, he really wants that Vraska to stick around. Thinking about the double block. And he will land on putting both those creatures in front.
Now here he's deciding on which one he wants to kill. He decides to go for the Brontodon, and if you're Dan Jessup, you have to have a sinking feeling in your stomach right now because that has to signify to you that the last card in Buchholz's hand is that Experimental Frenzy that buried him in Game 3.
Definitely scary times as we go back to Dan Jessup.
And next turn, that Law Rune Enforcer at the very least is going to be able to tap down one of the creatures from Dan Jessup's side, but we got a bit of a life buffer here.
Yeah, Jade Light Ranger was the draw, so we'll go up to 30 with the Wild Growth Walker. Take a look at a Hydroid Krasis on top of the deck.
That's a nice one. We're going to leave that one on top twice would be my guess. Dan's going to draw it with the Vraska Plus, gain some life here off of the Vraska, and then he's going to play his land from hand and probably play a 4/4 flyer to give himself a bit more protection for the following attack step.
Is there an argument to just use the Vraska to kill something here?
I mean, it does cost your Vraska its whole body, right? Like it's -3, so you could cash it in to pop off Benalish Marshall, but honestly, I'm not that afraid of these creatures. Really, the only thing the creatures are representing right now is killing the Vraska itself. So if you give Buchholz that freebie, you know, that's not really using your resources to the best of their advantage. With Jessup here, a little bit strangled on action, I think I would much rather go for a plus, cast a 4/4 Hydroid Krasis off the top.
Jessup's going to go into the tank on that decision. He lands on hitting the Benalish Marshall, puts the Vraska in the bin.
That's fine, too. He gets to play the land, and then he gets to play a bigger Hydro Krasis that draws more cards on the following turn. But the threat of Vraska, to me, just signifies a bigger long-term threat than just that Benalish Marshall on the battlefield. You're at 30 life. Really, the plus is only really threatening against the Vraska itself, and you're basically letting him do it for free.
Another Knight token off Chapter 2 on the history for Buchholz. We know one of those 2 cards in hand is Experimental Frenzy. Operating with perfect information for a short while, he knows the top card of Jessup's deck is Hydroid Krasis. Has a lot of work to do, though. Jessup is at 30.
All right, looks like we're going to be convoking here. I think he's potentially considering main phase activating the Danto and then convoking with the token. Paying a little too much here.
Yeah, Venerator locks it on. Looks like Knight, Vampire, other Knight.
That's fine. He just has a mana floating. He's using 3 creatures to pay for it. All 3 of the creatures should get a +1/+1 counter. They're just double checking with the judge because it is this is a slightly weird thing because Venerator Luxon specifically references the creatures that help pay for it.
Right.
So if you overpay on mana and tapping creatures, you know, usually I think it's going to be something like a rewind and then you just do it how you're trying to do it.
And notably, this extra mana, we know the last card is Experimental Frenzy. He still has untapped planes for that Law Rune Enforcer.
Right.
So this should not be a significant factor in the game. Just got to get a ruling on it, get this all figured out.
Yeah, and this should be relatively quick here, so Dan here knows that he's in a bit of a pickle, but with that Hydroid Krasis on top, you know, he's going to be poised to have a pretty big turn next turn. At the very least, going to be drawing 3 or 4 cards, making a giant flyer. Yeah, and Dan here, he's explaining he knows that it's not like going to matter that much. You know, he just wants to clarify that the convoke cost is being paid correctly because of how important it is with Venerated Luxon's ability itself.
It's definitely the kind of weird little pointless stumble that you'd make in a high-pressure situation like this, right? Not anything of major consequence. And you do see land is untapped. Those 3 creatures are growing. No attacks, go to Jessup.
Yeah, and here Buchholz has the ability over the next turn cycle to tap down 2 large threats and then start making large chunky attacks. This might be a spot where Danny can actually get a little bit aggressive.
Like X equals 6 on that Hydroid Krasis he explored to the top last turn. Go to 33, draw 3 cards, leaving 1 land untapped here.
And that's mostly because if he hits land plus cast down or Assassin's Trophy, that would allow him to cast it this turn and potentially knock off the Law Rune Enforcer.
He found land Ob Nixila's Cruelty, so we'll play that Overgrown Tomb tapped. And the Wild Growth Walker does come across.
No, it gets tapped down by the Law
Oh, you're
Rune.
right, sorry. Right, now on to Buchholz. Looking at that Experimental Frenzy, draw was a lot weaker, was a Law Rune Enforcer. He'll cast that.
Yeah, but if he has a land on top, that unlocks the Law Rune Enforcer he has on the battlefield. He can also attack with 3 creatures, transform the Legion's landing he has on the battlefield, and then use that mana that he gets untapped to use the Law Rune Enforcer. Those Knights are a bit bigger from the history going to Chapter 3, so this could be a pretty sizable attack in the face of only 1 blocker effectively in that Jade Light Ranger.
He's looking at how he wants to attack.
10 a.m. Modern Horizons pre-release players.
2 5-power Knights, a 4/4 Loxodon, and a 2/2 Vampire hanging around.
Yeah, I like not attacking with the Vampire token simply because, well,
Lands on no attacks.
I mean, I don't hate that either because if you attack with everything, you're losing out on a free mana later on with Legion's Landing, potentially. You would need to use the Law Rune Enforcer aggressively here.
We go to Jessup. I want to say I just spotted a Thrashing Brontodon in his hand.
Oh my.
That would be huge.
All right, so he's lined up 3 mana for a Cruelty, 4 mana for a Brontodon. And he actually might be able to turn the corner here and start getting aggressive. I would love it if that was the sequence here. Wow, what a draw.
Nissa, who shakes the world. Taps Forest for 2 green mana. Use the Nissa to make that a 3/3 and untap it. That Krasis found some heat.
Yeah, just a whole bunch of spells. And he's going to use the 2 mana floating from the untap and the forest, both doubling mana, to go ahead and play and crack that Brontodon. And here, I would love a shove. Just puts all your creatures sideways attacking. You know, don't give him a ton of good blocks. And the Obnix's Cruelty could be a potential blowout. But it looks like he's going to try to get a little tricky, save the Cruelty for the Law Rune Enforcer because that's kind of locking down his Krasis for the next few turns. I like it.
Yes,
I like
the
it.
attack was just for 6 with the Krasis. Buchholz to 13.
I wonder if Jessup's going to regret not making that Krasis a 7/7.
Yeah, right now it's a 3-turn clock with 1 point left behind. You see him use the Cruelty on the Enforcer, and we go to Buchholz. Draw with Scarmature Aspirant. He has that and another Enforcer in hand. Cast both of those.
Yeah, and another Enforcer is not a bad one because it does potentially protect you from the Hydroid Krasis.
City's Blessing is unlocked. So that Aspirant does fly, though remember the Krasis does trample. Bigger factor being that Law Rune Enforcer, as you mentioned.
Yeah, but it does have Summoning Sickness this turn, so Jessup gets in 1 free attack, and then he's going to need some sort of answer here. You know, he would love to draw another Hydroid Krasis with that Nissa Who Shakes the World, doubling his mana effectively, or, you know, giving him a huge boost of mana. He could draw quite a few cards here and really shut the door on this game. I got to say, that Thrashing Brontodon on the Experimental Frenzy looking like it was the key to this game for Dan Jessup.
Yeah, this game was really close in the mid-game here. Remember, Buchholz mulliganed to 5 here.
Yeah. Mulligan to 5, didn't really have the greatest start, played 3 or 4 1-drop cards on the first couple turns, drew a whole lot of 3-mana spells, and not a third land until roughly turn 6 or 7.
Krasis will knock Buchholz down to 7. Nissa turned another land into a creature. Jessup will pass back. Baffling End was the draw for Buchholz.
That'll buy him some time. That'll buy him some time for sure. Dan Jessup here is going to just keep making 3/3s with that Nissa Who Shakes the World, though. And a 3/3 every turn is better than a 1/1 every turn.
Sky Marcher Aspirant will fly over to knock the Nissa down to 5 loyalty. We're going to see Baffling End cast.
I was going to say, he might actually want to check the Wildgrowth Walker instead of the Krasis because he can keep tapping down the Krasis. But the life gain from Wildgrowth Walker doesn't seem like it's too much of a factor. I think Buchholz, in order to win this game, is going to have to go absolutely bananas with something like a second Experimental Frenzy in a couple turns, and that will effectively invalidate Dan Jessup's large amount of life gained.
So we exiled the Krasis.
He just needs to make sure he doesn't die in the air.
Now it's Jessup's turn. Looks like one of the 2 cards in hand is Assassin's Trophy. All right, floats some mana, uses Nissa to untap his forest. Now has 3 creature lands. And a Jade Light Ranger is going to go to 39.
So now if Dan wants to, he can move to attacks. After he declares attacks, whoa, that's a big one.
Hydroid Krasis explored to the top again.
I'm just going to let this play out. This is huge. Dan Jessup has the trophy. He can knock off Venerated if he wants to attack with all of his 3/3s.
The Wild Walker was up to 7. Buchholz will tap that with the Enforcer.
Yeah. Or you can just save it for the Law Rune Enforcer so it can't tap down that big Hydroacrasis. I like just playing defensive if I'm Dan. I think you just sit back, kind of let Buchholz draw nothing. You have the Assassin Trophy if something like Experimental Frenzy gets played. And if you attack with everything, you're getting some trades here, and you're losing a bunch of mana, so your Krasis on the following turn is a bit worse.
So you see no attacks. Back to Buchholz.
Whoa.
Benlish Marshall's the draw. He'll cast that. Is that enough?
I don't think there's great attacks here from Buchholz, though, so probably just going to have to sit back and play D. If he does attack, though, he's looking at getting his entire board eaten by those creatures from the other side, thanks to that trophy knocking off the Benlish Marshall.
The Knight tokens, because of that earlier Loxodon, they're up to 4/4s, but you mentioned that trophy, that throws a wrench in that.
You can also just line up some pretty decent double blocks. These lands can just kind of double jump in front of each of these creatures, and you would only lose basically 1 land per. Jade Lights, both being 4 power, allows him to trade evenly with those Knights as well if he wants to.
Right, kind of lining up an attack, looking at what blockers would look like. Don't believe these attacks are final yet. But looking at getting pretty aggressive. See both Knights, the Loxodon, the Vampire Token, and the Aspirant.
You got to be careful, though. You're only at 7. There's a lot of power coming back on the swing. You know, he is tapping down 3 creatures to make this attack. Dan can actually just, like, let him gain the 3 life, potentially only even 2 life from the Vampire Token. Trophy on the Benlish Marshall. Let the Nisu Shakes the World just die, and then untap an attack for lethal.
How is Buchholz going to win the game, though? You know?
I don't know. I don't know. Not with that Krasis staring down next turn. I have no idea. This looks really bad.
It's kind of in a no-win scenario. It seems rock in a hard place. Do I attack and have my creatures eaten that way, or do I hang back and let the Krasis that I know is coming eat me? Remember, Jessup is at 39. A lot of life to play with here. This one is for all the marbles. This is game 5.
I no longer recognize that statement.
That's why I said it.
Because
at Star City Games, we are always playing for marbles.
Well, in Versus Live, where I was playing for marbles.
Exactly.
Literally.
Yeah. You get it. Both players checking and rechecking the combat math here.
This is probably the most important turn of this game. It's definitely the most important turn of either player's tournament thus far. If a mistake is made from either side, it could be the difference between a win and a loss here.
Right, here's that Assassin's Trophy on that Marshall.
And that's going to shrink. That's going to simplify the board. For Danny, he's going to be able to make some good blocks, or just let that Nissa who shakes the world die.
Looking at Jade Light Ranger in front of the Vampire Token, and I think whether to cast the trophy or not was the big question for him in this combat.
Right. Okay, so there's 3 creatures on the other side of the battlefield that can block, right? You got 2 Knight tokens. He's going to be going up to 9, but luckily that's in increments of 3. Trades on the Knights with Vigilance is effectively the same as letting them block. So looking to do a couple blocks there. But Venerary Luxon, I think you can just let that go. I mean, if you want to keep the Nissa around, but you're going to be facing down 1 tapper is going to tap down the the Wild Growth Walker. And then you have a bunch of attackers coming back across.
All right, so you see Jade Light on Vampire Token, 2 lands in front of the 2 Knights. Those are clean trades, and he does choose to double block land Jade Light Ranger on the Loxodon, and the Loxodon will eat the land. All right, so the Knights are gone, the Loxodon's gone, the Aspirant connects for 2. Jessup loses all those creature lands.
Yeah, and he gets to keep the Nisu Shakes the World around, and I believe that's going to be lethal on the following turn because the Law Rune Enforcer can only prevent one creature from attacking. This creates an extra 3/3, and we got at least 3 creatures connecting, all with 3 power with Buchholz at 9.
Jessup draws that Krasis. We knew about that, but that's not even what the game's about.
Yeah, not anymore. He's going to go through the motions here just to make sure he does everything right. He's going to float 2. He's going to play a large Hydro Krasis pre-combat, and then he's going to send it in for the win.
As long as the Krasis does not deck him, which he's not even close to, this is all upside. Up to 42. 3 fresh cards.
Wildgrowth Walker tapped. Comes in for 10. That's
Here's
it.
the attack, and Danny Jessup rallies against Evan Buchholz.
Who's the better Jessup now?
Well, he didn't defeat
Still
Andrew.
Yeah,
so,
still
yeah,
Andrew.
still Andrew. Andrew won an invitational, but Danny has an opportunity to put